The wrench slipped from Marcus Delacroix's hand for the third time in 10 minutes, clattering against the concrete floor of his garage. Something wasn't right. In 15 years of Navy SEAL operations, his hands had never shaken during precision work. Not when defusing bombs in Kandahar, not when performing field surgery on wounded teammates. But here, in the quiet town of Copper Falls, working on a simple transmission repair, his grip failed him. The scars across his knuckles seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. Outside, a black pickup truck had been parked across the street for 2 hours, its occupants watching his every move through tinted windows. The same truck that had followed him yesterday when he drove to the hardware store, the same one that idled outside Elena's cafe every morning at exactly 8:15. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead despite the cool October air. The transmission fluid on his hands looked darker than it should, almost black. He'd changed thousands of these fluids before, and it was never this color, never this thick. Something was very wrong in Copper Falls, and it started the day he decided to open his business here. Marcus had come to Copper Falls 3 months ago with a simple plan: buy the abandoned garage on Main Street, fix vehicles for the local ranchers, and forget everything about his military career. No more midnight raids, no more life or death decisions, no more watching good men die in foreign deserts. Just him, his tools, and the honest work of keeping trucks and tractors running in this remote corner of Nevada. The town seemed perfect for disappearing. Population 400, nearest sheriff's station 40 miles away in Carson City, and enough broken-down vehicles to keep him busy without getting rich. What he hadn't counted on was Vincent Torres and his collection of followers who seemed to run Copper Falls like their personal kingdom. Torres had introduced himself the first week, walking into the garage with 3 men wearing matching black jackets despite the desert heat. He'd explained how things worked in their town. Every business owner paid a monthly fee for protection. Every single one. No exceptions. The fee wasn't optional, and neither was Torres's friendship. Marcus had politely declined, thinking the man would take the hint and leave him alone. He'd dealt with local strongmen before in Afghanistan and Iraq. Usually, a firm no, and a demonstration of competence was enough to earn respect. But Torres wasn't some village elder trying to maintain order in wartime. He was something else entirely. Something that made the hair on Marcus's neck stand up the way it did before an ambush. The black truck's engine finally started, breaking the afternoon silence. Marcus watched through his garage window as it pulled away, noting the license plate number out of habit. As the dust settled, Elena Ramirez appeared in the doorway of her cafe across the street, her apron stained with flour, her dark eyes meeting his with an expression he recognized from combat zones, fear mixed with determination. She mouthed 2 words that made his blood run cold. "They know." Marcus crossed the dusty street in 3 quick strides, his muscle memory automatically scanning the rooftops and alleyways for potential threats. Elena disappeared inside her cafe before he reached the door, but she'd left it unlocked. The bell above the entrance chimed once as he entered, and she immediately flipped the closed sign and drew the curtains. The smell of fresh coffee and baked bread couldn't mask the tension radiating from every line of her body. She was scared, but not the kind of fear that comes from immediate danger. This was the deep, bone-weary terror of someone who'd been living under threat for too long. Elena poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if he wanted any, her hands steady despite everything. She was probably in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the calloused hands of someone who worked 16-hour days. Her cafe was small but spotless, with mismatched furniture that somehow felt welcoming rather than chaotic. Local artwork covered the walls, and a bulletin board near the register displayed community announcements and photographs of missing pets. This was the heart of Copper Falls, the place where neighbors gathered to share news and gossip. Elena slid a cup across the table and sat down across from him, keeping her voice just above a whisper. Torres had been asking questions about Marcus since the day he arrived, not casual questions about his background or where he'd come from. Specific questions about his military service, about the teams he'd worked with, about missions that weren't supposed to exist in any official records. Someone had fed Torres information that only came from classified sources. Someone with access to files that were buried so deep that even Marcus didn't know all the details of his own operations. Elena explained how the protection system worked in Copper Falls. Every business owner paid Torres $500 monthly, supposedly for security services that prevented break-ins and vandalism. Those who refused to pay experienced mysterious problems: equipment failures, Supplier issues, customers who suddenly stopped coming. The local bank had been robbed twice in 6 months, but both times, Torres's businesses were untouched, while others in the same block were burglarized. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Torres didn't just collect money from business owners. He controlled them. He decided who succeeded and who failed, who stayed and who left town. The nearest law enforcement was 40 miles away, and by the time deputies responded to any calls, evidence had a way of disappearing. Witnesses developed sudden amnesia. Complaints were withdrawn before they could be properly investigated. Marcus learned that Elena had been paying Torres for 3 years, ever since her husband died and left her to run the cafe alone. She'd tried to resist at first, but after her delivery truck broke down 4 times in 2 weeks, and her coffee supplier suddenly doubled her rates, she'd given in. The monthly payments hurt, but losing the business would have meant losing everything. She'd been trapped in the system just like every other business owner in Copper Falls, until Marcus arrived and gave Torres his first real refusal. Now Torres was getting nervous, asking questions that suggested he knew exactly who Marcus was and what kind of training he'd received. The kind of training that could dismantle Torres's entire operation if applied correctly. Elena finished her story and waited for his response, hope and fear warring in her expression. Marcus stared into his coffee cup, recognizing the crossroads that every soldier eventually faces. He could pack up and leave tonight, find another town where his past wouldn't follow him, or he could stay and fight a battle that wasn't officially his to fight. Marcus finished his coffee and made his decision. Running had never been in his nature, not during 20 years of military service, and it wouldn't start now. But fighting Torres required information, strategy, and patience. This wasn't a battlefield where he could rely on superior firepower and air support. This was a civilian community, where any violence would hurt innocent people who were already suffering. Elena watched his face and seemed to read his answer before he spoke. She reached under the counter and pulled out a manila folder that she'd obviously prepared for this conversation. Inside were copies of every business license in Copper Falls, along with handwritten notes documenting when each owner had started paying Torres and what had happened to those who initially refused. The pattern was methodical and brutal. Torres had turned extortion into a science, applying just enough pressure to break resistance without attracting outside attention. Marcus studied the documents while Elena locked the front door and turned off the main lights, leaving only the dim bulb above their table. The information painted a picture of systematic corruption that went beyond simple criminal activity. Torres had contacts in the county assessor's office, the utilities department, and the state licensing bureau. When businesses refused to pay, their property taxes mysteriously increased, their electricity was cut off for routine maintenance, and their operating licenses were flagged for violation inspections that somehow never found any problems with Torres's establishments. The man had built a shadow government that operated parallel to official law enforcement. Elena pulled out another file containing photographs taken with a telephoto lens from her upstairs apartment window. Marcus recognized professional surveillance techniques in the images. Someone had documented Torres's organization with military precision, noting vehicle descriptions, personnel rotations, and daily routines. Elena's husband had been a Marine Corps intelligence specialist before opening the cafe, and apparently, he'd spent his final months gathering evidence against Torres before a sudden heart attack ended his investigation. The photographs showed Torres meeting regularly with men who wore expensive suits and drove government-issued vehicles, county officials, state inspectors, and at least 2 people who Elena identified as federal agents based on their distinct appearance and behavior patterns. Torres wasn't just running a local protection racket. He was part of something larger, something that explained how he'd obtained classified information about Marcus's military background. The federal connection worried Marcus more than the local corruption. If Torres had allies in Washington, then this situation was more dangerous than a simple criminal enterprise. Someone in the government might want Marcus neutralized for reasons that had nothing to do with his garage or his refusal to pay protection money. His military service had involved operations that certain people preferred to keep buried. Elena closed the files and met his eyes directly. She'd been waiting 3 years for someone with the skills to challenge Torres, someone who understood how these systems worked and how to dismantle them. Her husband had tried to fight alone and died for it. She wouldn't make the same mistake. But she needed to know that Marcus was truly committed to seeing this through, because once he started, Torres would escalate quickly. There would be no backing down, no negotiating a peaceful solution. This was war, fought with civilian rules that heavily favored the aggressor. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she was asking and what it would cost. The next morning, Marcus opened his garage at 5:30, 2 hours earlier than usual. He needed time to implement his plan before Torres's surveillance team arrived. Elena's husband had been smart enough to document Torres's operation, but he'd made the mistake of gathering evidence instead of taking action. Marcus wouldn't repeat that error. 20 years of special operations had taught him that intelligence without decisive action was just expensive paperwork. He pulled his toolbox from the locked cabinet and removed a device that looked like a standard automotive diagnostic scanner. In reality, it was a military-grade electronic surveillance detector that he'd modified to identify listening devices, GPS trackers, and wireless cameras. The scanner immediately found 3 bugs in his garage, one hidden inside the air compressor, another attached to the underside of his workbench, and a third concealed in the electrical panel. Professional installation, probably placed during the night while he was meeting with Elena. Torres was more sophisticated than Marcus had initially assumed. The man wasn't just running a local protection racket. He was conducting counterintelligence operations that required training and equipment that didn't come from criminal contacts. Marcus carefully photographed each device's location and serial numbers before leaving them in place. Removing the bugs would alert Torres that he'd discovered the surveillance, but knowing their locations gave him a tactical advantage. He could feed Torres false information while planning his real moves in areas that weren't monitored. Marcus spent the next hour conducting a detailed reconnaissance of Torres's known properties. The man operated from a compound on the outskirts of town that included a main house, 3 outbuildings, and a motor pool containing 6 vehicles. Chain-link fence topped with razor wire surrounded the property, and Marcus counted at least 4 men on rotating guard duty. The setup looked more like a military forward operating base than a criminal headquarters. But Marcus noticed something that Torres had missed. The compound's water supply came from a single well that fed into an above-ground storage tank. The electrical system ran through an exposed transformer mounted on a wooden pole 30 yards outside the fence line. Both systems were vulnerable to sabotage by someone with the right knowledge and equipment. More importantly, Marcus spotted a pattern in the guard rotations that created a 12-minute window of minimal coverage on the eastern perimeter every morning at 7:15. Torres had trained his men well, but he'd made the classic mistake of assuming that competence could substitute for proper military discipline. Marcus drove back to town and made a public show of visiting the hardware store, the post office, and Elena's cafe. He wanted Torres's surveillance team to see him following a normal routine while he was actually memorizing sight lines, escape routes, and potential rally points for the confrontation that was coming. Elena served him coffee and made casual conversation while secretly passing him a key to the storage room above her cafe. The room had a clear view of Torres's compound and would serve as an observation post when the situation escalated. By noon, Marcus had completed his preliminary assessment. Torres controlled Copper Falls through intimidation backed by superior organization and outside support. But the man had gotten comfortable operating without serious opposition. And comfort led to predictable patterns. Predictable patterns created opportunities for a trained operator who understood how to exploit structural weaknesses in seemingly impregnable systems. Marcus returned to his garage and resumed working on the transmission, making sure the surveillance microphones recorded normal sounds of routine mechanical work. But his mind was focused on tomorrow morning at 7:15, when Torres would learn that his newest protection racket target had skills that weren't listed in any civilian resume. Torres arrived at Marcus's garage the next afternoon with 4 men, instead of his usual 3. They drove 2 vehicles this time, a black pickup truck and a silver sedan that blocked both ends of the street. Marcus recognized the tactical positioning immediately. This wasn't a social visit or another attempt at negotiation. This was a demonstration of force designed to intimidate him into compliance. Marcus continued working on the transmission while Torres and his men entered the garage. He could feel their eyes studying every tool, every piece of equipment, every potential weapon within reach. Torres wore expensive boots and a tailored jacket that barely concealed the pistol holstered under his left arm. His men carried themselves with the confident swagger of people who'd never faced serious resistance. They were about to get their first lesson in the difference between local intimidation and military-trained opposition. Torres started with small talk, commenting on the quality of Marcus's work and the cleanliness of his shop. But his tone carried an undercurrent of threat that made his intentions clear. The protection fee had increased to $1,000 monthly, effective immediately. The rate hike was punishment for Marcus's lack of cooperation and a demonstration of what happened when Torres's generosity was refused. Additionally, Marcus would be required to service all vehicles belonging to Torres's organization at no charge. Free labor was part of the new arrangement. Marcus set down his wrench and faced Torres directly. Noting the positions of all four men without making it obvious, he was conducting a tactical assessment. The nearest exit was 12 feet away through the bay door. The tool cabinet contained several items that could serve as weapons if the situation escalated. Most importantly, the surveillance microphones that Torres had planted would record everything that happened next, which meant Marcus needed to be very careful about his response. Torres continued explaining the new terms while his men spread out to cover the garage's exits. They were professional enough to avoid obvious threatening gestures, but their intent was unmistakable. Marcus had 48 hours to make his first payment and demonstrate his willingness to cooperate. After that, the consequences would become progressively more severe until he learned to appreciate Torres's friendship. The veiled threats extended beyond Marcus to include Elena and any other business owners who might be considering similar resistance. Torres had decided to make Marcus an example that would discourage future defiance. The man spoke with the calm confidence of someone who'd never lost a confrontation in Copper Falls. He'd broken stronger men than Marcus, and he seemed genuinely puzzled by anyone who thought they could challenge his authority. Marcus listened without interrupting, noting details about Torres's speech patterns, nervous habits, and the way he interacted with his subordinates. The man was intelligent and organized, but he'd made the mistake of underestimating his opposition. Torres had researched Marcus's military background, but hadn't understood what that information actually meant in practical terms. He knew Marcus was a former SEAL, but he thought that just meant better physical conditioning and weapons training. He had no concept of the strategic thinking, psychological warfare capabilities, and systematic problem-solving skills that came with elite special operations experience. Torres finished his speech and waited for Marcus's response. The garage fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic on the main highway. Marcus cleaned the transmission fluid from his hands with a shop rag, taking his time while he considered his options. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and measured, without any hint of the anger building inside him. He thanked Torres for the visit and said he would need time to consider the new arrangement. Torres smiled and agreed that 48 hours should be sufficient for any reasonable man to make the right decision. Marcus waited until 3 in the morning before leaving his apartment above the garage. He'd spent the evening creating false activity patterns for Torres's surveillance microphones, playing recordings of routine mechanical work while he prepared his gear. The electronic scanner confirmed that the listening devices were still active, which meant Torres believed he was monitoring a man who was considering surrender rather than planning a systematic dismantling of his operation. The compound looked different in the pre-dawn darkness. Security lights created pools of harsh illumination that actually worked against the guards by destroying their night vision outside the lit areas. Marcus had learned in Afghanistan that overconfident enemies often created their own vulnerabilities by relying too heavily on technology instead of basic tactical principles. He approached from the eastern perimeter where his reconnaissance had identified the 12-minute gap in coverage. The chain-link fence was 10 feet high with razor wire, but Marcus had been scaling similar obstacles since his early SEAL training. More importantly, the fence wasn't electrified and showed no signs of motion sensors or pressure plates. Torres had built impressive-looking defenses without understanding their actual security value. The electrical transformer sat on its wooden pole like a monument to poor tactical thinking. No guards, no cameras, no sensors protecting the single point of failure that supplied power to the entire compound. Marcus had brought a small explosive charge that would destroy the transformer, without creating the kind of massive explosion that might harm innocent people in town. But as he examined the setup more closely, he realized that explosives weren't necessary. A simple short circuit would accomplish the same goal with less risk of collateral damage. He used wire cutters to access the transformer's main electrical panel, then carefully rerouted 2 high-voltage lines to create a feedback loop that would overload the system within hours. The sabotage would look like equipment failure rather than deliberate attack, which would buy him time before Torres realized he was under systematic assault. The water system required a different approach. Marcus couldn't simply poison the well without risking harm to anyone who might drink the water before Torres discovered the contamination. Instead, He introduced a harmless but foul-smelling chemical compound into the storage tank that would make the water undrinkable without causing actual illness. The compound would break down naturally within 72 hours. But during that time, Torres's compound would be without clean water for drinking, cooking, or basic sanitation. By 4:30, Marcus had returned to his garage and restored normal surveillance patterns for Torres's listening devices. He spent the next 2 hours working on actual mechanical repairs while monitoring police scanners for any reports of electrical problems or water contamination at Torres's compound. Nothing appeared on the emergency frequencies, which meant his sabotage had been subtle enough to avoid immediate detection. At 7:15, exactly when Marcus had calculated the transformer would fail, the lights went out across Torres's compound. Through Elena's telephoto lens, he watched guards stumbling around in the darkness trying to restart emergency generators that had never been properly maintained. The backup power system provided minimal lighting to the main house, but left the outbuildings and motor pool in complete darkness. Torres had relied so heavily on intimidation and local corruption that he'd never prepared for actual opposition from someone who understood military tactics. The water contamination would be discovered within hours when someone tried to make coffee or brush their teeth. Between the power failure and the water problem, Torres's compound would become functionally uninhabitable until both systems could be repaired. More importantly, the simultaneous failures would force Torres to realize that he was dealing with coordinated sabotage rather than random equipment problems. Marcus had announced his intentions without revealing his methods or his location. The message was unmistakable. The former Navy SEAL was no longer playing defense. Torres arrived at the garage before noon with 6 men, and fury that radiated from every line of his body. The power failure and water contamination had forced him to relocate his operation to a motel in Carson City, 40 miles away from his carefully constructed kingdom. More importantly, the simultaneous infrastructure failures had demonstrated that someone with serious training was systematically dismantling his control over Copper Falls. Marcus continued working on the transmission while Torres's men surrounded the garage, their casual confidence replaced by nervous alertness. They'd learned that their usual intimidation tactics might not be sufficient against their current target. Torres had traded his expensive jacket for tactical gear that included body armor and communication equipment. This wasn't a business meeting anymore. This was a military operation conducted by someone who finally understood the nature of his opponent. Torres began by acknowledging Marcus's capabilities in terms that confirmed his access to classified information. He knew about operations in Kandahar and Fallujah that weren't supposed to exist in any official records. He knew about techniques and training that Marcus had received during assignments that were buried under layers of national security classifications. Someone in the federal government was feeding Torres intelligence that could only come from the highest levels of the military command structure. But Torres had misunderstood the implications of that information. He thought knowing about Marcus's past would give him leverage for negotiation or intimidation. Instead, he'd revealed that this conflict extended far beyond a local protection racket. Someone wanted Marcus neutralized, and Torres was the weapon they'd chosen to accomplish that goal. The realization shifted Marcus's perspective on the entire situation. This wasn't about refusing to pay extortion money or defending a small community against criminal exploitation. This was about loose ends from military operations that certain people preferred to keep permanently buried. Marcus represented a potential source of embarrassing revelations for officials who'd built careers on missions that had never officially happened. Torres offered a new arrangement that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Marcus could leave Copper Falls immediately and relocate to a city where federal oversight would ensure his permanent silence about past operations. His mechanical skills would be welcomed at a government facility where former special operations personnel worked on sensitive projects that required security clearances and absolute discretion. In exchange for his cooperation, the harassment would stop and the people of Copper Falls would be left alone. The offer was simultaneously a bribe and a threat. Marcus could accept exile and protection, or he could continue fighting and face escalating pressure that would eventually involve resources far beyond Torres's local organization. Federal agencies had ways of making problems disappear that didn't require dramatic confrontations or violent resolutions. People simply vanished into legal tangles, administrative complications, and bureaucratic mazes that destroyed their lives without leaving obvious evidence of government interference. Marcus listened without interrupting, noting the tactical positions of Torres's men and the escape routes that remained available. Elena's cafe across the street showed no signs of activity, which meant she was either hiding or had been detained to prevent her from interfering. The nearest backup was the sheriff's department 40 miles away, but calling law enforcement would only bring more federal attention to a situation that was already compromised at the highest levels. Torres finished his presentation and waited for an answer. The garage fell silent except for the sound of wind rattling the corrugated metal roof. Marcus cleaned his hands with the shop rag and considered his options with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 15 years of dangerous operations. When he finally responded, his voice carried the calm certainty of someone who'd made his decision long before this conversation began. No. Torres's response to Marcus's refusal was swift and predictable. He gestured to his men, and they began moving to surround Marcus with coordinated precision. But Marcus had spent the conversation identifying each man's position, weapon placement, and likely reaction patterns. When Torres gave the signal, Marcus was already in motion. He grabbed the heavy transmission case and hurled it toward the nearest man, while simultaneously diving behind the workbench. The transmission struck Torres's lieutenant in the chest, sending him stumbling backward into the bay door controls. The garage door began closing automatically, trapping everyone inside while eliminating Torres's escape routes. Marcus rolled under a pickup truck and emerged behind two men who were still trying to understand how their tactical advantage had disappeared in seconds. His military training kicked in as muscle memory took over. He disabled both men with precise strikes that left them unconscious but alive, then seized their weapons before they hit the concrete floor. The sound of metal tools clattering and glass breaking from overturned equipment filled the enclosed space. Torres was shouting orders and trying to establish radio contact with backup units, but the garage's metal construction interfered with his communication equipment. Marcus had unconsciously chosen this location because it offered multiple defensive positions among the vehicles and heavy machinery. The remaining three men, including Torres, found themselves pinned behind inadequate cover, while Marcus controlled the high ground from his position on top of a lifted truck. The acrid smell of motor oil mixed with concrete dust as Torres tried to negotiate, offering increasingly desperate bribes and threats. But Marcus had moved beyond talking. This confrontation would end one way or another. During the struggle, Torres's tactical vest tore open, spilling documents and electronic devices across the garage floor. Marcus glimpsed classified military communication intercepts, financial records showing payments in cryptocurrency, and contact lists with foreign names. The realization hit him immediately. Torres wasn't just running a local protection racket. He was conducting espionage operations, selling government secrets to international buyers. The federal connections Torres had mentioned weren't protection. They were his sources for classified information that he was betraying to hostile foreign intelligence services. Marcus used a cutting torch to create a smokescreen that concealed his final approach. Torres and his remaining men were unconscious within minutes, overwhelmed by someone who had been trained to handle exactly this type of situation. Marcus immediately called the FBI field office in Carson City, reporting the espionage evidence he'd discovered. Within hours, federal agents arrived to process the crime scene and arrest the survivors. Torres faced charges for espionage, money laundering, and conspiracy against the United States. His government contacts were already being detained in coordinated raids across multiple states based on the evidence found in Marcus's garage. Marcus watched from Elena's cafe as federal agents secured Torres's compound and seized computers, communication equipment, and financial records. Elena poured coffee and thanked him for ending the protection racket that had terrorized local business owners for 3 years. She asked no questions about the federal charges or the espionage investigation. Some things were better left to proper authorities. Marcus reopened his garage the next morning, genuinely resuming his intended retirement as a mechanic in a small Nevada town. The mission he'd never asked for was complete. Torres was gone, his criminal organization was dismantled, and the people of Copper Falls could finally conduct business without paying tribute to criminals or worrying about foreign spies operating in their community. Marcus returned to work on the transmission, his hands steady and sure. The protection racket had ended. He was finally free to live the peaceful civilian life he'd originally sought in Copper Falls. If you enjoyed this Western story, click the video on your screen now to watch another thrilling tale from the American frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to support us in bringing you more exciting Western stories for sleep.